They say silence speaks louder than words, but I've learned there's a deeper kind, one that doesn't shout, doesn't even whisper, but steadily drains the meaning out of everything you've built. It's the silence of unread emails, of glances redirected, of your name slowly disappearing from conversations you used to lead. That kind of silence cuts differently. I didn't expect a celebration or applause. But after nearly a decade of managing the A's largest account, Xandrix Technologies, a global tech conglomerate, I thought my salary proposal at least deserved acknowledgement. I had nurtured that relationship through market crashes, leadership overhauls, and 2 brand reinventions. I didn't just keep the account. I grew it. My strategies carried over a third of the A's revenue. I wasn't just delivering value, I was the one insulating the company from collapse every time a storm hit. So yes, I thought a data-driven, non-emotional, and clearly benchmarked salary adjustment was not just fair, but overdue. I drafted the proposal carefully, linking my contributions directly to KPIs, quoting industry standards, and citing internal wins, retention metrics, client renewals, junior team promotions. I sent the email to James, our newly appointed CEO, and waited. 1 week passed. Then 2. The email remained unopened. At first, I made excuses for him. He was new. Busy. Learning the ropes. But it wasn't long before MAA, his assistant, young, ambitious, just a year out of grad school, joked during a meeting that James had said, "Those emails aren't top priority right now." It was said casually, a passing comment meant to be brushed off. I smiled, but I felt something sharp settle just beneath the surface. I followed up anyway. No reply. I offered to discuss it informally. Nothing. Not even a polite refusal, just stillness. And that's when it started sinking in. It wasn't about the raise. It never was. It was about visibility, recognition, about being seen. Not for applause, but for acknowledgement. But instead, I was becoming a quiet fixture in my own professional landscape. Invisible, not because I faded, but because someone decided to look away. Then came the meeting that shifted everything. I walked into the usual Friday strategy review and found MA sitting in my usual seat. Not adjacent. Not across the table. But in the exact chair I'd occupied for years. James looked up briefly and said, "Mia's leading this one today." Fresh energy. I sat down 2 chairs away, outwardly composed. Inside, something folded over. It wasn't the demotion. It was the erasure. That meeting was hers. But the slide deck, the format, even the script, it was mine. I had coached her during onboarding. Shared my templates. Helped her prep her first client call. And now she was being positioned, carefully, publicly, as my replacement. There was no confrontation. No formal restructure. Just a slow shift, one responsibility reassigned, one seat relocated, one account transferred. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was methodical. And that's what made it hurt more. It was being orchestrated in plain sight under the guise of progress. And no one, not one person, in that room looked at me like they didn't know. They avoided my gaze not out of ignorance, but out of shared guilt. Because they had all seen it unfold, inch by inch. They just didn't say anything. And for the first time in my career, I walked out of a meeting carrying more than just my laptop. I carried the certainty that I was no longer part of the future they were building. That evening, I didn't rush to leave. I stayed in the office long after the last keyboard clicks faded and the lights dimmed to their night-setting hum. I wasn't working. I was sitting in front of the same screen where, 6 months earlier, I had composed the proposal that still sat unread in James' inbox. Performance-based compensation review, first quarter metrics attached, that was the subject line. Neutral. Professional. Rooted in value, not emotion. I didn't open the message. I just hovered my cursor over it, reading it like a headline to a version of myself I could no longer access. It was never about the money but the principles that once governed my sense of professional worth, effort, consistency, results. But those weren't James' currency. His message had been clear since his first town hall: loyalty is not a business model. Optimization is. And I, despite every measurable win, was not optimized. I had not rebranded myself to match his arrival. I had not aligned my tone, my speed, my image to the optics he wanted to project. I wasn't new. I wasn't part of his showcase. And in his world, value wasn't something you built over time. It was something you performed on demand. That realization didn't come with a crash. It came with a slow, sinking clarity. I had done everything right, on paper. But I had underestimated the power of silent politics. The kind where you're not fired. You're faded. Over the following weeks, the evidence mounted. Delamay Imports, a legacy client I had personally onboarded and nurtured through 4 turbulent fiscal years, was reassigned to MIA. No warning. Just a calendar invite that appeared in my inbox with her name listed as lead. I walked into James' office and asked calmly if there had been a reason for the shift. He didn't look up from his tablet. "We're building Mia's portfolio," he said. "She needs exposure to high-stakes accounts. I'm sure you understand." I nodded, but my response came slow. "I do. I just hope the client does too." He gave a short laugh. "It's just logistics." But it wasn't logistics. It was removal by inches. And I was watching it happen with eyes wide open. That night, I sat in my car in the parking garage and cried. Not out of weakness, but because I needed a space to feel something unfiltered. It wasn't just about being passed over. It was about being slowly disassembled, roll by roll, account by account, until nothing was left that bore my fingerprints. But even then, I showed up the next morning. Not because I owed them more, but because I wasn't going to let someone else decide when my story ended. If they wanted me gone, they would have to say it outright. And if they didn't, I would use every moment left to reclaim what they had quietly tried to strip away. Not through protest but through presence. The betrayal had already happened. But I wasn't going to let that be the final act. There's a moment when you realize the game has shifted. But no one bothered to update the rules for you. That's where I was. No longer trying to win. Just trying to understand the board. I stopped sending follow-up emails, stopped reminding James of the unread proposal, stopped offering to circle back or touch base about compensation. Silence, I realized, could be more strategic than pleading. I started watching instead. Not in bitterness, but in calculation. I paid attention to every decision, every meeting restructure, every reassigned task. What was once mine was being sliced and redistributed like it had never been one person's to begin with. And yet, I stayed. Not out of defeat, but by choice. If they were going to erase me, I wanted to watch how they did it. Quietly. Meticulously. I documented everything. Not to use as a weapon, but as a record of who I had been when no one was looking. I tracked outcomes on accounts I was no longer leading. Noted discrepancies. Compared internal results to external perceptions. And while James praised fresh energy in public, I noted the back-channel emails where clients voiced confusion or dissatisfaction. I wasn't plotting revenge, it was clarity I was building. Meanwhile, I returned to the most valuable asset I still had, my history. I pulled up records of past campaigns. Feedback from clients. Milestone decks. Retention graphs. Correspondence that spanned nearly a decade. I reminded myself of what they no longer acknowledged. And then, on a night when I least expected it, I found something that didn't belong to the pattern. Buried in an old thread was an email from Marlene Tate, the VP of Strategy at Xandrix. It had been sent 6 months ago, right after our last successful product launch. At the time, I had skimmed it, grateful, but distracted. But now, the final line took on a different weight. "Ashley, if you ever feel this agency no longer values your brilliance, call me directly. We'd be lucky to have you." I read it 3 times. Then I just sat there, blinking at the screen, barely breathing. It wasn't an offer. Not exactly. But it was a signal. A lifeline I hadn't noticed while drowning. I didn't respond immediately. That would have been reaction, not strategy. Instead, I closed my laptop gently, as if protecting something fragile. For the first time in months, I didn't feel erased. I felt remembered. Not by the people in my office, but by the people I had served. The ones who knew the value behind the quiet. The next morning, I arrived at work the same way I always did. Same coffee. Same routine. Same quiet nods in the hallway. But something had shifted internally. I wasn't clinging anymore. I was observing, planning, preparing. And this time, I wasn't hoping to be heard. I was preparing to speak, in a voice that wouldn't need permission. For 3 days, I let the email sit there like a door slightly ajar, waiting for me to decide whether to walk through. Not because I was hesitant about Marlene's words, but because I wanted to respond with purpose, not desperation. I wasn't looking to escape. So I combed through everything: Xandrix's recent reports, their public statements, the gaps they had been quietly trying to fill since I'd been pushed aside. And what I saw didn't surprise me. There was inconsistency. A visible drop in campaign cohesion. Strategic pivots that seemed reactive, not visionary. I could see it clearly, because I had once been the one keeping their chaos from spilling over. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, the city humming quietly outside my window, I opened a blank reply to Marlene. I kept it simple. Hi Marlene. Your message meant more than you know. I'd be open to a conversation, strictly informal for now. Let me know when might be a good time. I hit send. And in that click, I felt a shift, not an explosion, not a breakthrough, just a firm internal turning. The next morning, her response came in within 20 minutes. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. I'll send the link. It felt fast. Too fast. But also right. The timing wasn't coincidence. Some part of me knew she had been waiting too. That evening, I didn't rehearse a pitch. I didn't prepare a resume. I focused instead on being clear about what I wanted, and more importantly, what I no longer needed. The call was brief. Marlene was direct. Xandrix, she said, had been reviewing their agency partnerships. They missed the consistency, the leadership, the foresight I used to provide. They were considering building a new strategic operations team in-house. And they wanted me to lead it. I asked questions. But deep down, I had already crossed the threshold. The decision wasn't a rescue. It was a reclamation. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside the office, sunlight catching the edges of my windshield, and breathed in something that didn't feel like relief. It felt like alignment. Quietly, I began collecting every artifact that tethered my work to Xandrix's growth. Client decks. Thank you emails. Campaign overviews. Timeline archives. Nothing stolen. Nothing inappropriate. Just my contribution, in full form. Meanwhile, the agency continued to drift. Delamay Imports, the client that had been so casually handed to MAA, had gone silent. Another key account, Greylight Labs, requested a strategy overhaul after internal confusion. James blamed market turbulence. But I knew better. I had seen this erosion before. I just wasn't the one holding it back anymore. Then, without ceremony, it happened. A single email from Xandrix's procurement team arrived in the company inbox. They were terminating the agency contract. No explanation. No grace period. Just, gone. The crown jewel of our client portfolio, gone. The fallout was instant. Emergency meetings. Frantic speculation. MIA pulled into impromptu strategy huddles. James pacing the hall like a man waiting for a verdict. And me? I typed at my desk, composed as ever, lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile no one saw. Not because I had won anything. It belonged to them now. The Monday after Xandrix's departure felt hollow in a way that no meeting, no resignation, no memo could quite capture. The office wasn't chaotic. It was slow. Like a machine that had lost just enough gears to keep turning. But not enough to alert those still depending on its motion. There were no announcements. No official statement of loss. Just quiet recalibration. Like they hoped no one would notice the weight that had vanished from the balance sheet. But you could feel it in the air. People walked slower. Glanced over shoulders more often. Spoke in hushed tones that mimicked focus, but were really just uncertainty in disguise. Even the copy machine hummed louder than usual. James didn't emerge from his office that morning. His usual routine of coffee and hand check-ins was replaced by a closed door and the faint glow of monitor light leaking through the glass. He didn't need to say anything. His silence confirmed everything. Without Xandrix, the agency wasn't just smaller. It was exposed. The absence wasn't just revenue. It was symbolic. A message to every remaining client that something foundational had cracked. I stayed quiet, as I always had. But I no longer fought to be seen. That effort had expired long before the contract did. I wasn't trying to re-enter the spotlight. I was watching the stage lose its structure. Then came the meeting. It was billed as a Q3 strategy alignment, All strategic leads required. I wasn't one anymore, at least not officially. But the invite had found its way to me. Whether by oversight or intention, I chose not to question it. I dressed with the precision of someone who had learned how to wear dignity like armor. Navy blazer. Muted blouse. Steady posture. I sat in the second row, far enough not to invite questions, close enough to see everything. James entered late. Eyes clouded. Expression unreadable. MIA followed behind, posture straighter than usual, makeup a little more polished. She looked like someone rehearsing confidence rather than possessing it. James began with buzzwords: agile, synergy, operational velocity. But his tone was flat. There was no conviction beneath the vocabulary. Then the slide changed. Strategic streamlining, that's what he called it. He spoke slowly. Deliberately. Some people have been here a long time, he said, and maybe they've done good work. But tenure doesn't guarantee alignment. No one moved. I didn't blink. Then came the line he had rehearsed probably a dozen times. If anyone feels entitled to compensation just because they've been around without adapting to the company's new direction, perhaps it's time they ask themselves whether this is still the right place for them. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. His eyes flicked in my direction for just a moment too long. It was enough. The room felt like it had swallowed its own breath. MA smoothed a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. Someone near the back coughed. Too loud, too. I kept my expression neutral. I took notes. I underlined nothing. But inside, something sharp settled into place. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. And still, I said nothing. I stayed until the end. I nodded at the right moments. I walked out at the same pace I walked in. But the part of me that once sought fairness, visibility, inclusion, that part no longer lingered at the door, waiting for it to open. I was done knocking. Now, I was preparing to build an entirely different room. That evening, I didn't cry. I didn't vent. I didn't even tell anyone what had happened in the boardroom. There was no need. It was already unraveling, and not just for me. I could see it in the corridors. Feel it in the way people spoke in half sentences and avoided eye contact. There was a stillness that didn't come from control, but from confusion. MIA no longer glowed with the same eager certainty. She moved like someone aware that the spotlight had become too hot. James tried to carry on with his lean model vision. But each step forward seemed to land in softer ground. The agency was not a machine. It was a body. And it had just lost its balance. Meanwhile, I was reclaiming mine. The night after the meeting, I reviewed every email I had ever exchanged with Xandrix. Every campaign strategy. Every executive feedback. Every thread of trust that had taken years to weave. And I didn't do it to reminisce. I did it to reconnect. Because beneath the politics, beneath the dismissal, beneath the sterile phrase strategic streamlining, I still had something no one else did. The history. The results. The relationship. And that history had a heartbeat. It pulsed back to life the moment I received a follow-up call. Not from Marlene this time. But from Xandrix's chief operating officer. He didn't waste time. Ashley, he said, we've reviewed the leadership structure for our upcoming innovation division. The vote was unanimous. We want you to head it. I said nothing at first, not out of shock, but to absorb the moment fully. You'll build the department from scratch. Hire your own team. Full authority. Direct report to executive suite. Remote flexibility. Compensation to match. I nodded slowly, alone in my living room, staring at the silent glow of my laptop. I asked a few questions, clarified expectations, ensured I would not be inheriting chaos. But deep down, I had already decided. I didn't need to be convinced. I needed to be respected. Later that night, I typed my acceptance email. Short. Professional. But behind every word was a quiet finality. Not vengeance. Not drama. Just truth. A truth that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. The next morning, James appeared at my desk, his first time in weeks. His smile didn't reach his eyes. His tie was off-center. His voice held too much caution for someone supposedly in control. Got a minute? I followed him to the boardroom. He closed the door behind us like it was a scene he wanted to script. Do you know why Xandrix pulled their account? I met his eyes. I assume it wasn't the weather. He gave a flat laugh. Come on, Ashley. I'm not part of their leadership team, I replied evenly. Not yet. His face shifted. So, they did reach out. I didn't confirm. I didn't need to. Silence, when chosen wisely, becomes its own statement. He exhaled hard, hands on hips, pacing. Look, I know things got tense. I may have overlooked some dynamics, but if you have any insight on how we might re-engage. I didn't let him finish. 6 months ago, I said, I sent a proposal detailing what Xandrix needed to feel valued. You never opened it. He blinked. You reassigned my accounts. Promoted someone with no experience. And then you publicly diminished everything I had built. He swallowed. I miscalculated. We both know, I said quietly, I was central to that relationship. He didn't argue. I've accepted an offer, I continued. Effective immediately, I'll be leading their strategic division. The silence that followed was thick. His face went pale. You're making a mistake. I shook my head. No, you did. And I walked out. Not just from the meeting, but from everything that had tried to make me believe I was small. The exit was quiet. No announcement. No applause. Just the sound of a door closing behind me. And in that sound, I heard something more powerful than recognition. I heard release. I didn't clear my desk that day. There wasn't much left to take. Over the past months, my workspace had been slowly stripped of its identity. First out of self-protection, then by design. The framed certificates had come down quietly. The thank you cards, the project souvenirs, the small signs of legacy. One by one, they disappeared. So when I walked out for the last time, I left behind a space that already felt vacant. Still, I paused. I stood by the elevator and looked back one final time. Not out of sentiment, but observation. The hum of fluorescent light. The flickering monitor screens. The forced small talk that didn't quite reach past the tension in people's voices. They didn't know I was leaving for good. And that was exactly how I wanted it. No send-off. No break room cake. No half-hearted speeches from people who hadn't made eye contact in weeks. I wanted the ending to match the silence that brought me here. The elevator doors closed, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not grief. Not relief. But clarity. In the parking garage, the air felt different, lighter, like I had stepped out of a long, slow suffocation. I didn't turn back. I didn't doubt. I drove home in silence. The kind that isn't empty, but whole. When I arrived, I poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and logged into my new email. ashley.carter@xandrix.com. And there it was. Confirmation. Not just of a new job, but of a new beginning. We're thrilled to have you on board. Let's build something exceptional together. I read the words slowly. No exaggeration. No flattery. Just direct recognition. It had been so long since I'd seen my name attached to possibility rather than erasure. I leaned back and let the moment settle. But I knew something else too. The story wasn't done. Because the ripple effects of silencing someone don't end when they leave. They begin. 3 weeks into my new role, I received a call. Not from a friend. Not from a recruiter. From a former client at the agency, Greylight Labs. Their CMO, someone I had helped through a brutal product launch, congratulated me. And then said, with deliberate ease, honestly, we're thinking of doing the same. I didn't gloat. I didn't promise anything. I just listened. 2 days later, 2 more clients reached out. Not with outrage or accusations, but with curiosity. They didn't want gossip. They wanted direction. They weren't following a name. They were following the work. Meanwhile, I heard from back channels that things inside the agency had begun to tilt. Delamere Imports had quietly backed out of their 4th quarter planning. Greylight delayed a major campaign. New business pitches were being pulled at the last minute. Internally, staff turnover doubled. MIA was reassigned, moved into an internal role, away from clients. And James? He stopped posting on LinkedIn. That told me everything. His public voice, the one he used to shape narrative, to maintain image, had gone quiet. Poetic, in a way. A man who dismissed silence as irrelevant. now drowning in it. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't reach out. I didn't explain. Because the system that tried to erase me was now erasing itself. Not with drama, but with absence. Strategic silence had always been my strength. Now it was their undoing. I didn't have to make a statement. The fallout spoke for itself. Clients who had once anchored quarterly projections were pulling away. Campaigns that had seemed locked in began to loosen at the seams. Internal meetings grew longer, more chaotic. Laced with tension that no amount of rebranding jargon could smooth over. There were no more Friday celebrations. No Slack emojis of encouragement. No company-wide recognitions. The office had become quieter. But not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of uncertainty. Of leadership unsure how to regain control without admitting they had ever lost it. Meanwhile, I remained exactly where I was meant to be. Building something new. Not from bitterness, but from intention. I didn't reach out to former colleagues. I didn't check on James's status updates or Mia's transitions. I didn't need to. I had nothing to reclaim there. That place had become a hollow shell of the purpose it once gave me. My energy now was invested elsewhere. But the universe, or perhaps something quieter and deeper, has a way of looping things back around. One afternoon, not long after onboarding my new team at Xandrix, I received an unexpected visit from the past. In the form of James. Or rather, an email from his personal address. The subject line, a favor. I read it 3 times before opening it. In a tone far too casual for the gravity of our history, he wrote that he was consulting independently now. That some former clients had spoken highly of the work we'd done together. That if I ever needed a collaborator or strategist for cross-agency initiatives, he'd be happy to reconnect. There was no mention of the ignored proposal. No mention of MIA. No acknowledgement of the months spent sidelining me into invisibility. Just a hollow attempt at rewriting the ending. I didn't respond. Not because I held a grudge. But because some silences are earned. And his had taken too long to arrive. That evening, I stood by my window, watching the city lights flicker into existence, one by one. I thought about the quiet meeting rooms. The scripts MIA used to recite. The slide decks I had once built while others reaped the credit. None of it carried weight now. Not because it didn't matter. But because I had stopped needing it to prove my worth. The company had collapsed under its own strategy. Not with a crash. But with a slow disintegration of trust, leadership, and coherence. There was no villain to blame. Only choices. And mine, the choice to walk away without spectacle, had proven the most powerful one I'd ever made. I didn't announce my success. I lived it. Every morning, I logged into a new system. Answered to leaders who respected clarity over ego. And led a team that didn't need convincing of my value. My calendar was full. But not with tasks designed to keep me occupied. It was full of momentum. My inbox no longer carried questions about whether I was still needed. It carried possibilities. And every now and then, when I hear that another client left the agency, or that someone from my old team has quietly moved on, I feel no glee. Only recognition. Recognition of how long it takes some people to realize. What happens when you silence the wrong person? When you let loyalty rot in the corner and call it optimization. And how deeply an organization can break. Without ever making a sound. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes, it lingers in what refuses to collapse. Despite every attempt to dismantle it. I didn't return to the agency in any form. Not as a partner. Not as a client. Not even as a distant consultant. I had no interest in revisiting a system that had chosen to unsee me. But the work I had done. The relationships I had built. They stayed. And they spoke louder than I ever needed to. And the trust one had nurtured? It didn't vanish with my exit. In fact, it began to echo more clearly in my absence. Clients who had once been held by shallow reassurances began to seek out depth again. Former colleagues started reaching out, not to gossip or reminisce, but to ask for insight. Some wanted to understand how I'd made the shift so seamlessly. Others, more quietly, asked what it felt like to be valued again. I never spoke ill of James or the agency. I didn't need to. What was unfolding spoke louder than anything I could say. The agency had tried to modernize by shedding its foundations. not realizing that strategy without substance is just noise. And when the noise settled, what remained was emptiness. Meanwhile, Xandrix had become the opposite. Deliberate. Considered. Willing to listen. I was no longer chasing acknowledgement. I was building systems that embedded it. Every process I created, every hire I approved, every strategy one led. It carried the quiet weight of someone who had once been erased. And now refused to let anyone else experience the same. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to protect something. In the third month of my new role, I was asked to speak at an industry summit. The invitation came not because I was visible online, but because the results spoke for themselves. I almost declined. But then I realized this wasn't about me. It was about giving shape to something others could follow. I spoke not about the agency, or the fallout, or even the salary that started it all. I spoke about systems. About trust. About the quiet erosion of culture when performance is divorced from recognition. And afterward, people came up. Not in crowds, not in fanfare. But in ones and twos. Leaders. Strategists. Quiet professionals who had endured their own versions of being overlooked. They didn't ask for advice. They just thanked me. For putting words to what they hadn't yet said aloud. That's when I understood. Legacy isn't measured by what you leave behind. It's measured by what you make possible for others once you've left. I had always believed power came from tenure. From titles. From staying in the room. But now I saw it differently. Real power is knowing when to leave, quietly. And letting the silence that follows do all the speaking you'll never have to. Some legacies are written in headlines. Mine was written in the quiet steadiness of people remembering where things used to work. And who made them work. I never asked anyone to follow me. But some did. Not because I extended invitations. But because familiarity with stability has a way of calling people back. When chaos becomes too loud. Greylight Labs reached out again. This time, not with curiosity. But with a proposal. They wanted to shift away from the agency completely. And re-establish strategy through a new partnership. Directly through the division I now led. A few weeks later, Delamere Imports requested a meeting. They had questions about my approach. My availability. And whether I might consult again. Now, outside the confines of red tape. I didn't accept every offer. But I listened. And I understood. People weren't chasing a brand. Or even a company. They were following trust. The kind that takes years to earn. And minutes to lose. And the agency? It kept shrinking. Not dramatically. Not with collapse. But with slow exhalations of relevance. Like something once full of momentum. That had forgotten how to move forward. James, from what I heard, stepped down from day-to-day operations. MIA stayed, but was reassigned to internal training roles. I wasn't interested in their trajectories. I was interested in what I could build now. Systems that weren't just dependent on individual talent. But reinforced by cultures that saw, heard, and respected. That talent before it was halfway out the door. My team grew. Not fast, but deliberately. I hired people who had been overlooked. Not because they weren't capable. But because they didn't fit a curated image of what value should look like. And slowly, the division took shape. Not around me. But around the shared belief. That work done with integrity doesn't need to shout to be felt. I never returned to the agency building. But I passed it once on my way to a client dinner. From the outside, it looked the same. Polished and forgettable. But I knew the truth. The heart had shifted elsewhere. Not into vengeance, but into continuity. Into the quiet ripple effect of someone. Who refused to disappear. Just because the room had chosen to look away. I still don't tell this story often. Not because it's painful. But because the ending wasn't designed for applause. It was designed to last. And if you're hearing it, please know this. Your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. I didn't walk away to make a point. I walked away to protect. The part of me that still believed in doing the work the right way. And in doing so, I became more than just a name they forgot. And to never, ever, let silence become a substitute for truth. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this spoke to you. More stories are coming soon.